Well, with more, we're now joined by security expert Michael Kempa. Michael, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Michael.
Listen, I want to begin with that new report that says the Privy Council did, in fact, prepare two briefings for the government, essentially warning the Prime Minister and his senior aides of a covert network that was working to interfere in the 2019 vote. I'm wondering, what questions does this revelation raise for you?
Well, it becomes increasingly implausible that the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister himself were not aware of concerns that were being raised by CSIS about infiltration of nominations processes around the Greater Toronto area. The question for me then becomes, how did they receive that information and how was it interpreted? Why was nothing done, in other words? So if I was to think that through, the sort of logic that I would expect the Prime Minister would deploy, he'd think to himself, all right, has there been anything here that violates the Elections Act? And the answer would probably be no, because this is intelligence, not evidence that could be used in a court. So the Prime Minister may have said, or his advisors may have said to him, if there's no criminal malfeasance here, you, Prime Minister, are not liable. And then they may have done a little bit of a calculation where they said to themselves, it's best we deal with this on our own, essentially allow an election to go forward and deal with it in-house, rather than create a scandal around something which is not a criminal matter as yet.
Well, let me pick up on what you just said, though, the difference between intelligence versus evidence that might be used in a criminal case. Because when you talk about intelligence, there is, of course, the facts or the details that fall under sensitive information. So how much leeway should be given to the Prime Minister here?
Depends on how much intelligence and how compelling it was. It was served by CSIS, to the Prime Minister's office, to the PCO, and to the Prime Minister himself. So intelligence can mean that simply a couple of human sources tipped CSIS off and said, there looks like there's something that might be going on here with the Chinese consulate sending either money or voters to particular candidates. So that wouldn't be particularly credible. But if CSIS had looked into it and found that there were many witnesses and many complaints, it's at that point that there would be less leeway to the Prime Minister. You would expect that you would take action on more reputable intelligence coming in.
So the Prime Minister has ordered, as you know, 2 investigations now, also said that a special rapporteur will essentially suggest a way forward. Can the Prime Minister afford to take this more cautious route, do you think?
I would think that going straight to an inquiry seems to be what everybody is clamoring for. I understand that impulse. We want to get to the bottom of this and figure out who knew what when, and is there anybody who basically now has to be accountable for any malfeasance. Now, if there is something that looks very bad for the governing Liberal Party and so forth, they may want to create a small delay where we look at the broader systems that might explain some of their decisions that were made that without understanding the context would look especially questionable. In other words, if we come to understand that this is the type of thing that's actually quite widespread, it plagues all political parties, then if it's subsequently found that the Prime Minister made a mistake, Canadians may be more forgiving. I think that's the logic for why they want to go this delay route.
Well, you yourself did run for a nomination in the past. Do you think this is more widespread than what we're seeing right now?
Well, yes. Based on my experience, looking around, see, nominations, as we know, political parties are private entities, and nominations take place according to their own rules and how they choose to enforce those rules. So on the ground, manipulating nominations to suit their party interests, it makes them very vulnerable to infiltration. The 2 big things are short notice on times and locations for nominations. Because if you don't know when and where your nomination will take place, all of a sudden that contest is very vulnerable to be taken over by anybody who can promise a candidate 200 or 300 people on a bus on short notice. So that could mean a foreign government. It could be a business interest. Could be an ideological interest, and candidates, in a sense, are quite dependent on accepting those offers, because if they don't, those people will just be sent to their competitors. It becomes a nasty business in that sense.
Mm-hmm. So can actually rebuild confidence in the electoral system then? You know, that might be the result of a public inquiry, that might be the result of this independent rapporteur. How might confidence be rebuilt in the system?
Well, the biggest one is quickly to identify these known shortcomings in the chain of electoral process. Start with nominations, clean them up. Start with cleansing the donations process. And then if the rapporteur finds that there is sufficient evidence to suggest that there was some malfeasance here, in a public capacity, people must be held to account. If you create doubts or the idea that people's votes mean little because the decisions are essentially being called by either foreign powers or other special interests, voter turnout will fall through the basement. You may as well hand the sledgehammer to the opponents of democracy.
Michael Kempa, thank you for this. Really appreciate the time tonight.
Thank you kindly.